Okay, so in our last Heathen Woman video, we talked about female warriors. And believe me, they weren't really all that common, but there are plenty of them to look at in antiquity. But they weren't the norm of society. We can say that honestly. We have a large pool of common women who played uh, great and small roles in the daily lives of households and kingdoms. So I guess the best way to begin this whole discussion is to go back and tell the story of a particular woman in Niall's saga. There was this beautiful, though very snarky woman who kind of attracted quite a few suitors, but nothing serious. One day she shows up to an assembly, and this fella and his friend are there. And he leans, and the fella, he leans over to his friend. He was like, I want to marry her. And his friend's like, she's awfully uptight. Are you sure you want to marry that one? Because you don't have the best of tempers. You should probably pick a woman with a milder personality. His friend's like, nope, she's beautiful. I want to marry her. So he goes up to her father and he's like, I want to marry your daughter. I've got a good farm. I'm prosperous. I want to do it now. So her father looks over. He's like, this man wants your hand in marriage. He seems like a good match. I'm going to go ahead and arrange the wedding. She looked over her father. She was like, this isn't a good match. She was like, I don't even like him. Her dad's like, oh, you'll learn to like him. So they get married. And her new husband bestows upon her all the traditional things that a husband does. He gives her the keys to the house, gives her the run of the house, because that is the tradition. She's in charge of everything. And he takes care of the farm. And she was a bit testy. It's not that she was being downtrodden in any way. She just didn't want to be married to the guy. So way leads on to way, and one season they have a really sucky harvest. And he's sitting around and he's lamenting over the fact that they have a really sucky harvest. And she walks up to him, and in so many words, she says, if you weren't so lazy, maybe the harvest wouldn't have been this bad. Well, that did not set right with him. So he stood up and he went, whap, he slapped her. And then he walks out and he's just like mad. Well, meanwhile, her foster father comes by. He's an uncle or a foster father. I can't remember which, but he's a man who takes on somewhat of a father-like figure in her life. Not to say she doesn't have a father, but it's very common for people to take on like an adopted parental role for other people. It's actually kind of common in the sagas, foster mothers, foster fathers. So our foster father drops by, and he walks in, and he's like, what happened to your face? And she's like, oh, he slapped me. He's like, is that so? So he goes out and he kills the guy. And her family ended up having to pay her husband's family, compensation for his death. It was just known. It was known. She kind of took advantage of the situation, and kind of played the victim card. She didn't want to be married to him. So, a few years go by, and another fella, it's same setup, it's an assembly, she's there with her father. New fella comes along, he looks at his friend, he said, I want to marry her. His friend leans in and says, you do know what happened to her last husband, right? He's like, I don't care, I want to marry her. So he goes up to her father and he's like, I want to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage. And her father's like, You do know what happened to her last husband, right? He's like, I don't care. He was like, I'll tell you what, you go over there and you talk to her personally, okay? And if you can get her to agree to marry you, I'll make the arrangements. So he does just that. He walks up to her and he strikes up a conversation. And, he kind of tells her what he has to offer her as, as a wife, if she will be his wife. And she says, I think I could learn to love you. So her father went ahead and made the arrangements. And that kind of sets the tone for the idea of like not so much like a kingdom or like the warrior cult, but now we're kind of getting into the domestic culture of the common woman. And that story kind of offers you some insight into how important it was to get two people together who could grow on each other, because divorces were really easy. They were really easy to get. I mean, it could be as simple as you were at an Ulthing or an assembly of some kind, and you look across the way and you see some beautiful woman who's single, and then you jump up from your table and you're like, I'm no longer married to her. It could be that easy sometimes. So you wanted to make sure that whatever marriage or whatever union you were bringing together, it was going to stay and it was going to last, because it could fall apart so very, very easy. There was nothing that was like you find in Christian traditions, where you have no choice. Like, you're going to be married and you got to stay married unless the church says you can get a divorce. It wasn't like that. It was a very open situation. You wanted people to stay together of their own free will. And the one thing that a woman brought into a marriage was this sense of companionship that we see examples of strewn throughout the sagas. There have been times where husbands have come to their wives because they had a dream and they wanted their wife to interpret it for them. And she would. We see other times where husbands will come to wives and ask for practical advice. And if she doesn't have any advice to give, she definitely has an understanding ear, something that he needs. So you see that there's this desire for companionship, and that a good woman would have been worth her weight in gold. Someone who was very wise, who could give advice, understanding, and she could kind of pass down that sort of elegance to her daughters. That was a very important thing. The common women, their roles, I would say, was far from mundane. They were very much important figures in the domestic culture. They weren't just popping out babies and fetching the meat for their husbands. No, the relationship between a good man and a good woman appears to have been one of companionship, enduring companionship. And so that's really important. So there you go. I'll be back to talk more about women roles in ancient Germania and how that is reflected or not reflected in our modern world.